Hey guys, welcome to our Unit 3 overview. This is going to introduce you to what's coming up in the next few weeks. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time in this unit. We actually are going to break it into two different parts. We'll have the first part, which we consider Part A, and that's going to be naming or nomenclature, so all the different ways to name and write the formulas for the various different compounds. And then Part B, we'll look at the forces and shapes that result from bonding of different elements. When it comes to naming them and the types of compounds, we're going to be looking at ionic, covalent, acids, and organic. Within each of those, there's specific ways that you have to write those compounds as well as how they are named. So we're going to be taking a look at all of those. So just by looking at the fact that we have 4 different types, you can see we're going to be spending quite a bit of time making sure that we understand this. Naming and writing formulas is crucial in our next step for chemistry before we get to writing and balancing equations. So this is really that next foundational step that we need to be sure that we truly master before we get into further units. So it's going to be really critical that you focus on this unit and make sure that you truly understand the specifics of what's going on. It is building off of what we learned in Units 1 and 2, especially in Unit 2 with regards to electrons and how the loss and gain of those electrons do allow for the ions to interact. Thinking about those trends of how various elements have higher or lower electronegativities and ionization energies, those all play a role in how we figure out if something becomes a ionic or covalent compound, and then in association with that, how do things, or what things are acids as well as what things are organic molecules. So when we're looking at atoms and ions, this is review kind of stuff, but just to keep us all on the same page, atoms versus ions, your atoms are ionically neutral. That's because you've got equal number of protons and electrons, whereas in your ions you have lost or gained electrons to give it a charge. So there is going to be a different number of protons and electrons. Only the electrons are the things that are moving, and so we either have an ion through the gaining or losing of electrons. As we talked about in previous units, there's 8 valence electrons, and we want those elements to become stable. And in order to do that, they need to gain or lose electrons to get to that 8 valence. Metals tend to lose their electrons to become cations, and nonmetals tend to gain electrons to become those anions. And we've looked at those words and talked about that a lot, but it's really going to be crucial in this next unit on ionic compounds to really make sure that we understand how that works so that we can put those two things together to make compounds. Periodic table, we've seen this before. If you think about our last unit, we were looking at the S, P, D, and F blocks, or those sublevels with regards to the orbitals of where the electrons actually reside. We now are going to add in those charges, your +1, your +2, +3. We kind of skipped that 4th column with regards to ionic compounds because typically those only share electrons. We'll talk about what that means later. Your -3, -2, -1, and then of course those noble gases that don't really want to do anything because they're already stable. We've talked about the fact that the first group, or the alkali metals, have 1 valence electron, and so it's much easier for them to lose that 1 than to gain 7 more to get to 8. That's why they have that +1 charge. The same thing is true for the alkaline earth metals, in that they have 2 valence electrons. They're going to lose those 2 to become stable. So things, again, that we've talked about already, but just piling on those layers on your periodic table, that's going to really be your best friend from really here on out. In naming, we are going to learn how to write the correct formulas and the names for ionic compounds, and that is the first big step of doing that. You'll go into a lot of detail on how that naming system actually works, so there's some memorization in that, as well as just learning how the process works. For molecular compounds, we're talking about nonmetals, so these are going to be where we have only small molecules. You don't have ions in here. It's simply a molecule. And there's no opposite charge because they're all nonmetals. And if we think back to our periodic table, nonmetals are going to have negative charges. So there's not going to be an attraction between opposite charges. It's simply going to be a shared bond. And that leads us to, you can't really figure out or use the charges to determine how many of each atom you have because there's no charges present. You basically have to look at what the name is giving you or what the formula is giving you to determine the number of electrons that are being shared in those covalent bonds. Naming, we're going to learn how to do the correct formulas and names for these covalent molecules. It includes includes your acids as well as organic molecules. So there's really 3 different naming types within just the covalent. You have general covalent, and then you have specifically a subset of that, which is acids, and then the third subset of that, or the second subset of that, would be the organic molecules. So again, you're looking really at 3 different areas. So we really do have 4 different naming systems that we're going to be looking at in this half unit. What's going to be really important is having those memorized elements that I've been asking you to do since the summer. So really being able to know what those elements are, where they are on the periodic table, what their symbols are, that's really going to be a crucial first step to make sure that you're not spending so much time looking that part up before trying to figure out how to name it or how to write the formula for it. You're also going to be given polyatomic ions. They're actually on the back of your periodic tables, and there's going to be ones that you really want to have memorized. There's going to be some videos to give you some hints on how to memorize things or how to memorize those. Some people just do flashcards and it works out great. Others need the mnemonic devices, and so there's lots of different ways and options that you'll have in order to memorize those. But those are really important to have memorized, especially their formulas and their charges as well as their names, because we're going to be using them both in ionic naming and formula writing as well as in acids. So we're going to be pulling those in 2 different places. Seriously, your periodic table will be your best friend. I said this earlier, but having those key pieces of information on there, your charges, where the different electron orbitals are, understanding which have variable charges, which ones have static charges, what those charges actually are. So all of that stuff is really valuable information from your periodic table. And you're going to be using it so much that there's going to be, eventually, probably by the end of this unit, that you have stuff memorized on there, whether you want to or not. But it's going to be critical that you keep up with your periodic table, that you always have it in class, that you constantly are using that. And then last but not least, with regards to importance in this 3A unit, as well as even in the 3B, is that you practice. The only way you get really good at nomenclature and writing formulas is to practice. When we get to the next part of it, which is the forces and bonding, practice is still going to be really important. But for this first section, it's so very important that you practice. In the 3B section, we're going to be looking at shapes and forces. The forces that we're going to be talking about are associated with bonding. So we're going to be looking at ionic, covalent, and molecular bonding. And so although we're using that in the nomenclature understanding, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into why those elements bond together, and then as a result, especially with regards to the covalent structures, why they form the shapes that they do. Why do they have a molecular structure that they do? And that is looking at what's called VSEPR, or the valence shell electron pair repulsion model. And so there's going to be some different shapes that come out of understanding how those covalent bonds are making things share, so to speak. And last but not least, in this beginning of this unit, I'm going to be introducing what's called the differentiated learning approach. And basically, this is going to be for students whose grade drops below a 78. There's going to be some additional requirements that will come into play for you. This is to help you get back up to that B level, and or at least try and get there. But it's going to be a way for us to work together in a more structured manner to make sure that you're not falling behind, and falling behind even more, because if you're at a 78, it's telling me there's something going on at this point that we really need to focus on, whether it's an organizational thing, whether it's a time study management thing, or whether there's just some things you're not understanding. And so we're going to be looking at how that comes into play. I'll be talking about this more in class, but I just did want to let you know coming into things that we do have some scaffolding that's going to be coming in with regards to how your grading comes in. We've already done a few of the satellite checkpoint grades, and those are going to come into play or continue to come into play as we especially look at the nomenclature. It's really, really important that you get this, because if we don't know how to write and name things, we can't get to the next unit where we are writing and balancing equations. So I can't stress the importance. This unit really is our hinge point to success down the road versus not succeeding or struggling really greatly down the road. So I just wanted to let you know that there is going to be some scaffolding for those students after Unit 2 whose grade has dropped below a 78. But that doesn't mean that if you're at that B level and you're not happy with that grade, that you can't take some of these suggestions in the differentiated learning and help your own grade. But those would be more voluntary. Whereas if you do drop, or if your grade does drop, then there's going to be a little bit more mandatory things that you have to do to make sure that you are succeeding in class, because that's really all I want you to do. You may not love chemistry. Most people don't. Most people never will, but I do want you to have appreciation for it. And more importantly, I want you to learn how to succeed. And success doesn't always mean an A. Success doesn't always mean that you get it on the first try. Success, for me especially, is defined as, are you continuing to work hard to figure things out, to learn those skills that are needed in order to persevere through things that are potentially challenging. And so I just wanted to give you a little heads up that that's coming down the pike, and we'll talk about that on Friday when I get back to see y'all then. Until then, thanks.